They thought I was finished. They sat across from me in that courtroom with their lawyer in a three-piece suit and their matching smirks, and they genuinely believed the old man had nothing left. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years running a small but profitable lumber supply company in western Tennessee. Nothing flashy. We weren't moving mansions or building skyscrapers. We supplied wood to contractors, home builders, deck installers, fencing guys. The kind of business that hums along quietly and makes decent money year after year, if you're disciplined and you don't get greedy. I was never greedy. That was always my problem, I think. I trusted people because I wasn't built the way they were. My daughter married her husband 11 years ago. I'll call him my son-in-law, though after everything that happened, the word sticks in my throat. He was charming when they met, good-looking in that easy way some men are, the kind who never had to work too hard for anything because the world just handed things to them. My daughter was 30 at the time. She was happy. I walked her down the aisle at a little chapel outside of Nashville, and when she cried, I cried too. I'm not ashamed of that. A year into their marriage, my son-in-law came to me with a business proposal. He wanted to start a home renovation company. He had the contacts, he said. He had the vision. What he didn't have was capital. He needed $250,000 to get it started, and he wanted it as a partnership investment, not a loan. I'd owned 30% of the company. My wife, God rest her soul, she passed 3 years before all of this. She was the cautious one. She would have said no. She would have looked at him with those quiet gray eyes and said, "I don't think so, honey." And that would have been the end of it. But she was gone, and I was 61 and a little lonely and maybe a little too eager to keep my daughter close, and I said yes. I signed the papers. I wired the money. I became 30% owner of a home renovation company called Crestline Home Solutions, registered in Shelby County, Tennessee. For the first year, things seemed fine. My son-in-law sent me quarterly reports. Numbers looked reasonable, not spectacular, but reasonable. He'd come over for Sunday dinners every few weeks, bring my daughter, talk about contracts they'd landed, clients they were building relationships with. I felt good about it. I felt like family meant something. Then things started to shift. The quarterly reports became less frequent. When I asked my daughter about the business, she'd get vague. Busy, she'd say. Growing pains. My son-in-law stopped coming to Sunday dinners. When I'd call him directly, there was always a reason he couldn't talk. Job site issue. Meeting with a contractor. Kids were sick. They had 2 children by then, my grandchildren, and I didn't want to create tension. So I waited. I gave it time. It was my accountant who first noticed something wrong. I'd asked him to take a look at my own books in preparation for a potential sale of my lumber company. I was thinking about retiring, simplifying my life. While he was going through everything, he flagged the Crestline investment. He said the numbers I'd been sent didn't match anything he could verify through public filings. The company had reported losses for 2 consecutive years to the state, but had shown me profit. Somebody was maintaining 2 sets of numbers. I sat in his office for a long time after he told me that. The air conditioning was humming. There was a framed print of the Grand Tetons on the wall behind his desk. I remember looking at it while he kept talking, and I just went somewhere else for a minute. Not because I was shocked, because some part of me had known for a while, and hadn't let myself look at it directly. I asked him not to say anything to anyone. I went home, and I sat in the kitchen where my wife used to drink her coffee every morning, and I started thinking carefully. I didn't call a lawyer right away. I called a private investigator first. A man I'd been referred to through a friend. Quiet guy, former state auditor, knew how to follow a paper trail without leaving footprints. I told him what I suspected and asked him to find out what was real. I gave him 90 days and told him to send everything to a post office box I rented that same afternoon. What came back over the next 3 months was worse than I'd imagined. My son-in-law had been siphoning money from Crestline from nearly the beginning. He'd set up a shell company, a landscaping business registered in his brother's name down in Mississippi, and Crestline had been paying that shell company for subcontracted labor that never existed. Over 4 years, somewhere between $380,000 and $420,000 had moved through that structure. My original investment, plus another $160,000 I'd added in year 2 when he told me the company needed equipment upgrades, plus profits that should have come to me as a partial owner but never did. That wasn't the worst part. The worst part was my daughter. The investigator found emails. He found text messages that had been backed up to a shared cloud account my son-in-law hadn't thought to secure. In those messages, my daughter discussed the arrangement, not as a victim, as a participant. There were messages between her and her husband about what to tell me, how to keep me from asking too many questions, how to buy time until the lumber company sale went through, because that's when Dad will really have money to work with. She called me the old man in those messages. I read that sitting in my truck in the parking lot of a Cracker Barrel off I-40. I had to read it twice. I sat there for probably 40 minutes. A family with 3 kids walked past my window at one point, the kids chasing each other around their parents' legs, and I watched them and thought about the day my daughter was born. This small red furious thing that I held against my chest in a hospital room in Memphis while my wife slept, and I thought I would never let anything bad happen to her. I went home. I did not call her. I did not call him. I started making a different kind of plan. My lawyer, not a family lawyer, a litigation attorney I found through my accountant, told me that what we had was strong, but that I needed to be patient. The civil case would be straightforward. The potential criminal case, fraud and breach of fiduciary duty, would require coordination with the district attorney's office and possibly the state's financial crimes unit. It would take time to build correctly. I said I had time. I was retired. I had nothing but time. For 6 months, I did nothing that looked like anything. I attended my grandson's baseball games. I brought food to Sunday church potlucks. I called my daughter every week and listened to her chat about the kids and her garden and a home improvement project they were doing on the master bath. And I said, "That sounds nice, and give the kids a hug from me." And I hung up the phone and sat very still. What I was actually doing during those 6 months was documenting everything, every communication I'd had with my son-in-law going back to the beginning. Every bank transfer, every report he'd sent me. My attorney was working with the financial crimes investigator. A forensic accountant was going through Crestline's real books, which we had obtained through a court order as part of a quiet civil filing my attorney had initiated without making noise. My son-in-law didn't know the civil case had been filed. It was structured carefully. He wasn't served until we were ready. The day he was served, he called my daughter. She called me 20 minutes later. Her voice was a temperature I'd never heard from her before, hard and cold in a way that didn't sound like my child at all. She said her husband had received some kind of legal notice, and she wanted to know what I thought I was doing. She said I was being manipulated by people who wanted to take their business apart. She said, "Dad, you need to stop this before it goes somewhere. Nobody wants it to go." I said, "I love you. I'll talk to you soon." Then I hung up. 3 weeks later, my son-in-law's attorney contacted my attorney and proposed a settlement. They would repay $200,000, roughly half the documented losses, and I would withdraw the civil case and sign a release. My attorney forwarded it to me. I read it at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. I said no. His attorney countered at $250. I said no. At $275, I said no. My son-in-law apparently decided that if I wasn't going to settle, he was going to litigate. His attorney filed a counterclaim alleging that I had misrepresented my contributions to Crestline and had interfered with the company's operations through improper access to business records. It was nonsense, but it was designed to muddy the water and cost me money. My son-in-law told my daughter, and she relayed this to my nephew, who told me that I was a bitter old man who didn't understand business and that the judge was going to see through my little fishing expedition. He actually used the words, "bitter old man." The morning of the civil hearing, I drove myself to the courthouse in Memphis. I wore a gray jacket, pressed slacks, a blue tie my wife had given me for our 35th anniversary. I arrived early and sat in the hallway on a wooden bench and drank bad coffee from a machine and watched people come and go through the glass doors. My son-in-law arrived with his attorney and 2 people I didn't recognize, probably there for support or appearance. My daughter was with him. She was dressed like she was going to lunch, not to court. She looked at me when they walked past. I looked back at her. Neither of us said anything. His attorney was younger than I expected, sharp-looking, the kind of attorney that costs $400 an hour and knows it. My son-in-law stood next to him with his arms folded and a half-smile that I understood was meant for me. He thought this was going to go a certain way. He'd read me as sentimental, as someone who would eventually flinch. When the judge took the bench, I watched my son-in-law's attorney stand up and begin laying out their counter-narrative. I was a controlling investor. I had exceeded my authority as a 30% partner. The losses were the result of market conditions, not mismanagement. I had cherry-picked data from incomplete records. It went on for a while. The attorney was smooth. He had a way of making things sound reasonable even when they weren't. Then my attorney stood up. She said she'd like to present the court with a summary of forensic accounting findings that had been submitted as Exhibit A through Exhibit F. She walked through the shell company. She walked through the false subcontracting payments. She showed the side-by-side comparison of the financials my son-in-law had sent me versus the actual state filings. She put the text messages on screen, the ones with my daughter discussing how to manage the old man's questions. The courtroom was very quiet. The judge, a woman in her mid-50s, reading glasses on the end of her nose, looked at the messages for a long moment. She looked up at my son-in-law. He had stopped smiling. She asked his attorney if his client would like a recess to consult. His attorney leaned over and whispered to my son-in-law. My son-in-law's jaw was working like he was chewing something he couldn't swallow. They took the recess. When we came back in, his attorney requested a conference with both parties in chambers. My attorney agreed. We went into the judge's chambers, a small room with too many books and a window overlooking the parking garage, and the judge set her glasses on her desk and looked at my son-in-law's attorney and said, "Counselor, I've reviewed the exhibits. I want to hear your client's position on the shell company payments." The attorney started to give a prepared answer. The judge stopped him. "Not the prepared answer," she said, "the actual position." The silence that followed lasted about 10 seconds. It felt longer. My son-in-law was sitting across a small conference table from me, and for the first time in 11 years I watched him not know what to say. The confidence was gone. What was underneath wasn't anything dramatic, not remorse, not anger, just a man calculating odds and finding them bad. His attorney asked about the possibility of a structured settlement. The judge said she would not be advising on settlement terms, but she would note that the State Financial Crimes Unit had been copied on the court's receipt of the forensic accounting exhibits, as required under Tennessee statute, when documented fraud exceeded a certain threshold. She said this in the same tone you'd use to mention that rain was expected Thursday. My son-in-law looked at his attorney. His attorney looked at the table. We settled that afternoon. The full amount, $440,000, which accounted for the documented theft, lost distributions, and investigative costs. Repayment structured over 24 months with a lien on the marital home as security. His counterclaim withdrawn with prejudice. A separate agreement that Crestline would be dissolved and its assets liquidated with proceeds applied to the repayment. He also, at my attorney's insistence, signed a statement of account acknowledging the fraud. My attorney wanted it on record. I wanted it on record. The judge did not object. I walked out of that courthouse at 3:40 in the afternoon. The September sun was lower than it had been when I walked in. There was a slight cool in the air, the first real hint that summer was ending. I stood on the courthouse steps for a minute and just breathed. My daughter called me that evening. Her voice was different from the last time. Not cold now, but careful. Brittle. Like something that had been fired too quickly and might crack under pressure. She said her husband had told her what happened. She said she needed to know where things stood between us. I told her I loved her. I told her I would always love her. I told her that what she had done, participating in those conversations, using those words about me, helping to plan how to extract money from her father, that was going to take a long time for me to find a way through. Maybe I would get there. I didn't know yet. She started to cry. She said she hadn't realized how far it had gone. She said he had told her it was just business strategy. I said, "Sweetheart, there was nothing strategic about calling your father the old man while you planned how to take his money." She cried harder. I told her I needed time. I told her the grandchildren were always welcome in my home, that would never change. I told her I'd talk to her again when I was ready. Then I hung up the phone and sat at my kitchen table, in the same chair I'd sat in when I read those messages the first time. And I felt something settle in me that I didn't have a clean word for. Not happiness, not triumph, something quieter, the feeling of a man who did things the right way and didn't look away from what was hard, and came out the other side still himself. The Financial Crimes Unit opened a formal investigation 4 months later. I was told by my attorney that my son-in-law cooperated extensively in exchange for consideration on sentencing. What that means for where things end up, I don't know yet. The process moves at its own pace. What I know is this: I still have my lumber company. I chose not to sell it after all. I go in 3 days a week and work with the guys in the yard and have lunch at the same diner I've been going to for 20 years. I have my health. I have my grandchildren on alternating Saturdays, and we bake things and watch old westerns, and I teach them to play chess on the board my wife bought at a garage sale in 1987. I am 64 years old, and I have a long memory, a good accountant, and the patience that comes from understanding that the truth doesn't rush, but it does, eventually, arrive. They thought the old man had nothing left. They miscounted. I keep coming back to the moment I sat in my truck in that Cracker Barrel parking lot, reading those messages on my phone. Not the words themselves, though I remember every one of them, but the stillness that came after. I didn't slam the steering wheel. I didn't call anyone. I just sat there and watched a family walk past my window, kids chasing each other around their parents' legs, and I felt something shift inside me. Not break, shift. That's the thing nobody tells you about betrayal from someone you raised. It doesn't feel like a wound. Not at first. It feels like the ground has changed composition beneath your feet. Like you've been walking on something you thought was solid and you just learned it was hollow the whole time. And you have a choice right there. In that parking lot, in that stillness, you can collapse into it, or you can get very, very clear. I got clear. What I did over the next 6 months wasn't complicated. I documented. I hired people who were better than me at specific things, and I let them do their jobs. I kept showing up to baseball games and church potlucks and weekly phone calls with my daughter, and I kept my voice even and my face normal, and I did not tip my hand once. That kind of patience isn't something you're born with. I think it grows in you through years of running a business where you can't afford to react before you've thought, where every decision you make has a downstream consequence you'll be living with for a long time. Discipline, I've always believed, is just deferred action in service of a better outcome. You learn to hold things. The honesty part, and this is the part that I think people underestimate, wasn't just about having evidence. It was about being willing to see what was true, even when it cost me something to see it. My daughter was in those messages, not as a bystander. The easiest thing in the world would have been to build a story where she was manipulated, where she didn't fully understand what was happening, where I could be angry at my son-in-law exclusively and keep her clean. I couldn't do that, not because I didn't love her. I love her more than I have words for, but because looking away from the truth to protect yourself from pain is exactly the kind of thing that keeps people in bad situations their whole lives. I'd watched my accountant try to soften the news for me. I'd stopped him. See it clearly, I told him. Tell me exactly what is there. You can't make good decisions in the dark. And a third thing, the one that held the other two together, was just the refusal to quit before it was finished. There were moments when settling felt reasonable. $250,000, and this chapter closes, and maybe you rebuild something with your daughter on better ground. I understand the appeal of that, but I knew if I accepted half of what was taken from me because the whole amount felt like a fight I wasn't sure I could win, I would have spent the rest of my life knowing I flinched, not for the money, for the principle of what it means to see a wrong thing through to the right place. I'm 64. I go into the lumber yard 3 days a week. I play chess with my grandchildren on Saturday afternoons. The investigation is ongoing. Some things are still unresolved and will be for a while. But I am still exactly who I was before they decided to underestimate me. And that, more than any settlement figure, is the part I intend to keep.